Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Today, Wayne LaPierre, head of the National Rifle Association, hosted a number of Republican politicians, including the ex-president, at his organization's annual conference in Houston, just days after 19 elementary school children and 2 teachers were slaughtered by a gunman a few hundred miles away. Now, all of the speakers at today's conference acknowledged the shooting, and really, how could they not? And all of them blamed it on everything but the AR-15 style rifle that the gunman bought as soon as he was legally able to when he turned 18. This is standard. I mean, this is the script. We know how this goes for NRA and the politicians who it pays. In the aftermath of the recurring horror these weapons of war have wrought, LaPierre and his allies in the Republican Party just throw out any excuse to try to explain why guns are not the problem. It was following the Sandy Hook massacre 10 years ago, which left 20 children and 6 adults dead, that LaPierre provided one of the most indelible excuses of the modern age.
The only way to stop a monster from killing our kids is to be personally involved and invested in a plan of absolute protection. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Ironically, that's the moral cosmology of a child, like a small kid who thinks about the world, good guys with guns and bad guys with guns. And that phrase and the sentiment behind it are now inescapable. I mean, it was obviously ridiculous back then, a ludicrous thing to say, and ludicrous now. It's simply not how a functioning society works. It's a Wild West state of nature in which conflicts are resolved only through violence and bloodshed. But it meant more guns, right? If you're Wayne LaPierre and you're solving at the board, they're sitting around, they're brainstorming like, oh, there's 20 murdered kids, guns, more guns? Maybe we just try to shoot the moon here. The notion that only a good guy with a gun can stop a bad guy with a gun is still, it's an organizing policy principle of the Republican Party. It is the mythos sold by the conservative movement for the last 10 years, at least, to justify constantly expanding access in every legislative session to guns, like Texas Governor Greg Abbott has done. And the aftermath of this latest horrifying massacre, they trotted it out again because it's what they do. The mythos was on full display again. Everyone praising with solemnity the good guys with guns and claiming those good guys with those guns prevented an even greater tragedy.
The reality is, as horrible as what happened, it could have been worse. The reason it was not worse is because law enforcement officials did what they do. They showed amazing courage by running toward gunfire for the singular purpose of trying to save lives.
But as he was approaching, as the governor mentioned earlier, there was a brave Consolidated Independent School District resource officer that approached him, engaged him, and at that time, gunfire was not exchanged, but the subject was able to make it into the school.
During a briefing from law enforcement, 2 of the Uvalde police officers who responded to the shooting shared their harrowing experience with us. And in the face of such unthinkable evil, their courage was unwavering.
I'm just going to read what Greg Abbott said again, just I wanted to let it sink in. Hold on one second. The reason it was not worse is because law enforcement officials did what they do. They showed amazing courage by running toward gunfire for the singular purpose of trying to save lives. That is a comforting story if you're mourning the horror of what's happened. But here's the thing. That's not just not true. It's, we think now, the opposite of the truth. The argument that heroic law enforcement officers, the proverbial good guy with guns, showed unwavering courage and prevented the massacre from being even worse, that's not at all how it looks, as we learn the facts. After 3 days of misdirection, false start, shifting stories, we have arrived at what appears to be the horrible almost unspeakable, almost not believable truth of what actually happened in that classroom in Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Just listen to the Texas Director of Public Safety today admitting to the total and complete failure by police to stop the massacre.
There was discussion early on that an ISD, consolidated ISD for Uvalde, had officer, was a resource officer and had confronted the subject. That did not happen. The bottom line is that officer was not on scene, not on campus, but had heard the 911 call with a man with a gun, drove immediately to the area, sped to what he thought was the man with a gun, to the back of the school, what turned out to be a teacher and not the suspect. In doing so, he drove right by the suspect, who was hunkered down behind a vehicle, where he began shooting at the school. The caller identified, I'll not say her name, but she was in room 112, called 911 at 12:03. The duration of the call was 1 minute and 23 seconds. She identified herself and whispered she's in room 112. At 12:10, she called back. In room 12, advised there multiple dead.
What happens when the officers try and break through either that door or another door, get inside that classroom?
None at that time.
Why?
The on-scene commander at the time believed that it had transitioned from an active shooter to a barricaded subject. The question simply is this: there was a 40-minute gap. And if the 911 operators were aware that children were alive in that classroom, why weren't officers notified of that? And if that's the case, why didn't they take action? That's the question. Hey, for the benefit of hindsight, where I'm sitting now, of course it was not the right decision. It was the wrong decision. Period. There's no excuse for that.
19 police officers were inside the school for more than 40 minutes as the gunman holed up in a classroom with those terrified little children, and those panicked, desperate kids kept calling 911 and pleading with them to send in the police. I listened to this press conference today. I kept thinking that I was missing something, or I was screwing it up. I was left speechless. Now, let's just say that, let's just be clear here. The officer in charge on the scene, who that Department of Public Safety official said made this decision, it was not an active shooter situation, and the 19 cops inside the building didn't have to go in, despite the gunman locking himself in a classroom full of kids and a barrage of 911 calls. That individual wasn't present to defend himself today, or herself. And I gotta say, given the record of official pronouncements so far, there's no reason to take anyone from law enforcement in this situation says at face value, full stop. So that's what we have now. But it does seem confirmed, even as we will likely learn more in the coming weeks, the worst possible set of facts appears to be the true one. That the police utterly failed with their guns, the good guys with the guns in the school utterly failed to protect those kids. That they set up a cordon outside the school and yelled at and threatened and prevented parents from rushing in, even it seems as the gunman was still inside. And in addition to the police response being an unfathomable failure, it is also just a profoundly upsetting demonstration of the bankruptcy of the arms race theory of violence prevention, something that just Wayne LaPierre pulled out of the ether. So he had something to say, this decades-long project outlined by LaPierre 10 years ago. Just give them, everybody, guns. And arm an increasingly militarized police force. More and more money, more and more weapons. Make sure they all have SWAT teams. They all need to have SWAT teams because you never know. So if one of the weapons ends up in the hands of a bad guy, we've got a huge paramilitary unit that's trained to go in there and stop them. It's all BS. They've built up to this moment. And here it was. Here's the proving ground. And we just saw it fail in real time. And yet, even after that, in the wake of that, after that press conference today, in which that failure was enunciated, at the NRA conference, after we learned about the failure of the good guys with guns, here's what happened.
Ultimately, as we all know, what stops armed bad guys is armed good guys.
As the age-old saying goes, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Have you ever heard that? No, you've never heard that.
If those are the two categories, I'm curious for Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, which category were the police in this estimation? Of course, it's not two categories of people. That's the whole point. Whatever Donald Trump and Ted Cruz say, the entire NRA worldview collapsed in on itself in a pool of blood in that elementary school in Uvalde, Texas on Tuesday. And in the end, the sheer brutal bankruptcy of what these cretins have been proposing, Cruz and Trump and Greg Abbott, Wayne LaPierre, everyone celebrating guns and gun culture in Houston today, it has been laid bare.